My hand were shaking when I answered the phone. Not from age, but from someone I couldn't name yet, some instinct that told me my life was about to change in ways I wasn't ready for. The voice on the other end belonged to my son, Marcus, and in those first seconds, I knew he wasn't calling to say hello or ask how I was doing. He never did anymore. My name is Raymond Harlow, and I'm 62 years old. I spent 40 years working as a supervisor at the manufacturing plant outside Akron, Ohio, giving everything I had to provide for my family. Everything. But that voice on the phone, my son's voice, contained a desperation I'd never heard before, mixed with something that sounded like anger, maybe disappointment, maybe relief that he finally had a way out. Marcus told me his wife, Victoria, had arranged everything. Her parents were having financial problems, something about medical bills and a failed business venture. They needed a place to live immediately, and Victoria had already decided where they would go. My cottage. The cottage I'd bought 6 months ago with my entire pension. The place I'd escaped to. The one place in the world that was mine and mine alone. He said they would arrive on Friday. For days away. He said it wasn't a question. It was happening. And if I didn't like it, I could move back to the city and stay with them. I could hear Victoria in the background, her sharp voice cutting through his words like broken glass. She was laughing, actually laughing about this. My son had become a man I didn't recognize anymore, someone who would turn his father's dream into a bargaining chip. I didn't argue with Marcus. I didn't raise my voice or tell him how betrayed I felt or how my heart was breaking into pieces. I simply said, okay, and hung up the phone. That's when I made a decision, not out of anger or revenge, though those feelings were burning inside me like a fire I couldn't contain. I made a decision out of something deeper, something quieter. If they want to come into my world, the world I'd carefully built away from everyone, then I would show them something they would never forget. I would show them the real price of betrayal. I would show them what it looks like when a man you spent your entire life loving finally stops loving you back. But I wouldn't do it out of cruelty. I would do it out of truth. That Friday morning, I woke up at 4 o'clock. I hadn't slept, spending the entire night preparing. I made coffee and sat on the porch of my cottage, looking out at the dense forest that surrounded it, at the trees I'd planted myself, at the garden where I'd been growing tomatoes and herbs for the past 6 months. This was supposed to be my sanctuary. This was supposed to be where I healed from all the years of sacrifice, all the years of being invisible. My son had called me 3 times since that first phone call, but I didn't answer. Victoria had sent text messages saying they would arrive around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I didn't respond to those either. Instead, I went through my cottage one more time, checking every corner, making sure what I'd hidden was still there, waiting like a secret that had been burning to escape for decades. When the car pulled up to my cottage that Friday afternoon, I was standing on the porch. I could see them before they could see me. Victoria's parents, Robert and Patricia Malone, both in their 70s, looked tired and uncertain. Victoria looked angry, like she convinced herself that this was my fault somehow, that her in-laws invading my home was something I should have prevented. And Marcus looked ashamed. That was the worst part. He looked ashamed, but not enough to stop this. Not enough to stand up to his wife. Not enough to be the man I'd raised him to be. I watched them get their luggage out of the car. I watched Patricia put her hand on Marcus's shoulder like she was comforting him. And then I walked inside my cottage and locked the door behind me. They would have the keys soon enough. But first, they needed to see what I'd left for them. A letter, a diary, and a truth that would change everything about how they saw me, and more importantly, how they saw themselves. The story of Raymond Harlow didn't begin with a cottage in the forest or a son who'd forgotten his name. It began 40 years earlier in a hospital room where Marcus was born and his mother, Sarah, died. She had been 28 years old. The doctor said it was complications, said nobody could have predicted it, said these things happen. But nothing they said made it less true. I was left standing in that room with a baby boy who didn't know his mother's name, who would never know the woman who'd given him life. I was 24 years old, a high school graduate with no college degree, no connections, no plan for how to raise a child alone. But I had something else. I had a determination that burned so hot it could have melted steel. My parents wanted me to move back home with them, to let them help raise Marcus while I went back to school or built some kind of career. I refused. This was my son, my responsibility, my love. So I worked nights at the manufacturing plant while my sister watched Marcus during the day. When I came home at 5 in the morning, exhausted beyond belief, I would hold my son and tell him about his mother. I told him stories about Sarah's laugh, about how she loved to dance, about how she wanted to be a nurse so she could help people. I told him these things every single day so that even though he'd never met her, part of her would live inside him. When Marcus was 4, I quit my night shift and took a supervisor position during the day. It paid less, but it meant I could pick him up from school, help with his homework, and make sure he knew that his father would always be there. The years passed in a blur of work and single parenthood. I made mistakes. I yelled sometimes when I was too tired to be patient. I cried alone in my bedroom at night, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But I never once made Marcus feel like he was a burden. I went to every school play, every graduation, every game. I helped him pick a college. I told him he was smart enough to be anything he wanted to be. I told him he was loved more than he could possibly understand. And for a long time, he believed me. For a long time, we were a team, just the two of us against the world. Marcus was the light of my life. He was my reason for getting up every morning. He was the answer to every prayer I'd ever whispered. When Marcus was 17, he fell in love with a girl named Victoria Nichols. She came from money, real money, the kind of money that Raymond Harlow had only read about in magazines. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. Her mother had her own jewelry business. They were the kind of people who looked through people like me, who saw the working class as a help. But Marcus loved her, and I wanted him to be happy. So I welcomed her into our home with open arms. I took her to dinners I could barely afford. I was kind to her even when she made comments about how small our house was, how outdated our furniture looked, how the neighborhood wasn't exactly prestigious. I did all of this because I thought that if I showed her love, if I showed her kindness, she would love my son the way he deserved to be loved. I should have seen the warning signs. The way Victoria looked at my old car. The way she corrected Marcus when he spoke, suggesting he used better vocabulary or more impressive words. The way she would hint that his dreams weren't ambitious enough, that he could do better than a state university, that he should want more out of life. But I was blinded by my son's happiness, or what I thought was happiness. I wanted him to have everything I never had. I wanted him to climb higher than I ever could. And if Victoria was going to be his ladder, then I would hold that ladder steady no matter how much it hurt to watch him climb away from me. What I didn't realize was that he wasn't climbing towards something better. He was being pulled away from everything real. He was being trained to forget where he came from. He was being taught to be ashamed of a father who loved him with every fiber of his being. Marcus and Victoria got engaged 3 days after he graduated from college. He was 22 years old, still figuring out who he was, still learning how to be a man. Victoria was 23 and already completely certain about everything. She wanted a big wedding. No, not big. Massive. She wanted it at the Grandview Country Club, a place where I'd never set foot, where people like me weren't exactly welcome. She wanted 300 guests. She wanted a live orchestra. She wanted everything to be perfect in a way that I could barely comprehend, let alone afford to contribute to. I told Marcus I would pay for whatever I could. I had about $15,000 saved, money I'd been putting aside for years, money I planned to use for his graduate school or his first house. But that didn't matter anymore. That was his money. That was his future. If Victoria wanted an orchestra, then he would have an orchestra. The night before the wedding, Marcus came to see me at my house. We sat on the front porch like we used to do when he was younger, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he took my hand, something he hadn't done in years, and he thanked me. He said he knew everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given up, just so he could have opportunities. He said that Victoria sometimes made comments about how different we were, how she didn't understand my jokes or my way of looking at the world, but that she was trying, and that he loved me no matter what. I held my son's hand and I cried. I cried because I could see something in his eyes that terrified me. I could see doubt. I could see the beginning of him being pulled away from me by a woman who would never appreciate what it meant to be a Harlow, to be strong and loyal and true. On the day of the wedding, I wore the best suit I owned, a navy blue thing I bought 10 years ago for a funeral. It was out of style, and it didn't fit me quite right anymore, but it was what I had. I walked down the aisle of the country club and sat in the front row and watched my son marry a woman who smiled at him while looking completely bored, like she was already thinking about the next thing on her agenda. During the reception, Victoria's father barely acknowledged me. Victoria's mother looked at me with something between pity and disgust. I danced with my son at his wedding, one of the last real moments we would share, and I told him that I was proud of him, that I loved him, that I would always be here for him no matter what happened. He hugged me and told me he loved me too, but even then I could feel him slipping away. They bought a house in the suburbs, a beautiful 2-story colonial with white shutters and a manicured lawn. Victoria decorated it with the help of a professional designer. It was like something out of a magazine, cold and perfect, and completely devoid of personality. I visited once a month, and every time I walked in, I felt like an intruder. Victoria would smile that polite smile and ask how work was going, but she didn't really care about the answer. Marcus was busy building his career. He'd gone into finance, something Victoria's father had encouraged, something that paid very well and required him to work 70-hour weeks. I barely saw him anymore. When I did see him, he was stressed and tired and distant. He talked about money and investments and things I didn't understand. He didn't talk about his dreams or his feelings anymore. He didn't talk about his mother or the life we'd built together. The first real sign of trouble came 5 years after the wedding. Marcus was 27 years old, successful by all accounts, making more money in a year than I'd made in my entire life. But when I saw him, something inside me recognized a deep unhappiness. He'd put on weight and then lost it rapidly. His eyes had a hollow quality that no amount of money could fix. Victoria was spending time with another man, something I noticed but never said. I saw him at a restaurant when I was picking up takeout food. I saw him holding her hand, and I saw the way she looked at him compared to the way she looked at Marcus. She was unhappy, and she was taking it out on my son. But when I tried to talk to Marcus about it, he got defensive. He said I was imagining things, that Victoria loved him, that everything was fine. He said I needed to mind my own business, that I was always trying to stir up drama where there wasn't any. Those words cut deeper than any knife ever could. After that conversation, I didn't see Marcus for 6 months. I would call and leave voicemails. I would send text messages. I would even drive to his house sometimes and sit outside, hoping that maybe he'd come out and we could talk, but he never did. Victoria would text back with messages like, "He's very busy right now," or "Now isn't a good time." I was slowly being erased from my son's life by a woman who'd never respected me, never wanted me around, and saw me as a reminder where Marcus came from and how far he'd supposedly come. I started to understand that this wasn't just about a marriage. This was about control. This was about Victoria remaking my son into someone acceptable to her world, someone who was ashamed of his working-class father, someone who could be molded and shaped and improved. The messages started coming differently after that. First, just Christmas, then his birthday, then nothing for an entire year. I didn't know what I'd done wrong, what I'd said that caused this rift, but I spent countless nights replaying every conversation, every interaction, trying to figure out where I'd failed as a father. Maybe I hadn't been ambitious enough. Maybe I'd held him back. Maybe my love had suffocated him somehow. I was retired by this point, having worked with a manufacturing plant for 40 years, and I received my pension, enough to live on but not enough to afford the kind of life Marcus had built. I rattled around the old house, the same house where I'd raised him alone, surrounded by memories that felt more real than the present. Then came the day I saw my son's face on the website of a prestigious financial firm. He was in a photo with several other executives, all of them smiling that perfect smile that wealthy people have, the kind that doesn't reach their eyes. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. There was a quote from him about his philosophy of money management. He talked about discipline and ambition and making smart choices. He didn't sound like my son anymore. He sounded like someone reading lines that had been written for him. I clicked on other parts of the website and found his bio. It talked about his background, where he went to college, where he worked now, but it didn't mention me. It didn't mention that he was raised by a single father who worked 60-hour weeks. It didn't mention anything real about where he came from. It was like I'd been completely edited out of his existence. I called him that day. It was the first time I'd called in over a year. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear surprise in his voice, then quickly what sounded like annoyance. I asked him how he was doing. He said he was fine, very busy. Was there something important? I asked if he got my messages over the past year. There was a long pause. He said he had, but that things were complicated, and he didn't know what to say to me. I asked him what was complicated about being someone's father and son. He said it wasn't about that. It was about different worlds, different values, different ways of looking at life. He said his therapist had told him that sometimes people's families of origin can hold them back, and that he needed to focus on building the life he wanted. I felt something break inside me that day. Not slowly, like a crack spreading through glass, but all at once, like something fundamental had shattered. My son, the boy I'd carried from the hospital as an infant, the child I'd raised alone, the man I believed in through every hard time and every challenge, had been trained by his wife and his therapist to see me as baggage, to see me as someone who'd held him back, to see me as a problem to be managed rather than a parent to be cherished. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I simply said that I understood, and I hung up the phone. That night, I started making plans for the cottage. I started planning to get away from everyone and everything that had hurt me, to find a place where I could be alone, and finally figure out who I was when I wasn't being someone's father. 6 months after that phone call, I bought the cottage. It was on 15 acres of forest about 2 hours north of Akron, in a part of Ohio that still felt wild and untamed. The real estate agent showed me a dozen other properties, nice suburban homes and lake houses and things that made financial sense. But the cottage called to me. It was old, built in the 1970s, weathered and a little crooked, like it had survived a lot and was tired but still standing. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that looked out into nothing but trees. The forest surrounded it completely, a wall of green that promised privacy and peace and a chance to disappear. The asking price was reasonable, and when I saw it, I knew that this was where I was supposed to be. I used my entire retirement savings to buy it outright. No mortgage, no debt, just a clean purchase and the deed in my name. Some people might have thought I was insane, spending everything on a cottage in the middle of nowhere after working 40 years for my pension. But I didn't care what people thought anymore. I was done trying to impress anyone, done trying to be what other people wanted me to be, done with the idea that success meant having a lot of money or a big career. Success, I was learning, meant having a place where you could be yourself without apology. I spent my first weeks there just sitting on the porch, breathing, healing, remembering who Raymond Harlow was when he wasn't performing for anyone. I fixed up the cottage slowly. I replaced the roof that was starting to leak. I refinished the hardwood floors. I built new shelves and repainted the walls a soft gray that reminded me of dawn. I planted a garden out back, growing vegetables and herbs, learning about composting and soil quality from books I checked out from the library in the nearest town. I started hiking through the forest, learning the trails, finding places where the trees opened up the meadows filled with wildflowers. I began to read again, something I hadn't done since college, spending entire days with books about philosophy and history, and travel to places I would probably never see. I was learning to be alone in a way that felt peaceful rather than lonely. The isolation was what I needed. After years of being erased from my son's life, after years of trying to be what everyone needed me to be, I finally had the space to figure out what I actually wanted. What did Raymond Harlow want when nobody was watching? What made him happy? What made him feel alive? I discovered that I liked cooking, really liked it, spending hours making soups and stews and bread from scratch. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever been, despite being older, because I was finally at peace. I discovered that the things I had thought made life worth living, the external validations and achievements and approvals, were actually pretty hollow. What made life worth living was simple things. A good cup of coffee on the porch, a sunset that turned the sky pink and gold, the sound of rain on the roof, the knowledge that I'd done my best and I could finally rest. I didn't completely cut myself off from the world. I went into town occasionally, got to know some of the locals, became a regular at a diner, where an older woman named Betty would always save me a table by the window. I volunteered at the local library one day a week, and I got involved with a community garden project. I was building a quiet life, a small but real community of people who knew me and respected me. For the first time in decades, I was making friends as an adult, not as Marcus's father or as an employee trying to impress my supervisor. I was just Raymond, and that was enough. Then came the phone call from my son that changed everything. When Marcus first called me to say that his wife's parents needed a place to stay, I felt the old pain come rushing back. But it was different this time. I wasn't the desperate father trying to please him anymore. I was a man who'd learned to live without him, and that made all the difference. I told him yes, not because I owed him anything, but because I had a plan. I had time to think. I had 6 months of peace to figure out what I really wanted to do, and what I wanted was something that terrified me and thrilled me at the same time. I wanted my son to understand what he'd done. I wanted him to feel, for just a moment, the kind of emptiness and abandonment that I'd felt. The week before they arrived, I prepared. I made copies of documents, letters, photographs, things that told the story of my life, of my love, of my sacrifice. I organized them carefully in the smallest bedroom of the cottage, the one that was supposed to be my reading room, my retreat. I arranged them like an exhibit in a museum, each item telling a story, each photograph capturing a moment that mattered. There were pictures of Marcus as a baby, pictures of us at his high school graduation, pictures of him at his college dorm with his arm around me, pictures from the last real conversation we'd had before Victoria had successfully erased me from his life. There were letters I'd written but never sent, letters where I'd poured out my heart, my fears, my love, my pain. I also prepared a journal, a place where I'd written down every important moment of Marcus's life. From the day he was born to the day I bought the cottage. It was over 300 pages of careful handwriting, a chronicle of a father's love. In those pages, I'd written about his first smile, his first word, the day he rode his bike without training wheels, his first day of school, his first heartbreak, his graduation, his wedding. I'd written about how proud I was of him, about my dreams for his future, about the person I believed he could be. I'd also written about the pain of being pushed away, the confusion and heartbreak of being forgotten, the slow realization that my investment in his life was not going to be returned with gratitude or love. It was a heavy document, heavy with emotion and truth. I set up the cottage carefully. I made sure the guest rooms were clean and comfortable. I put fresh linens on the beds and towels in the bathrooms. I stocked the refrigerator with food, wanting them to have no excuse to complain about hospitality. I was playing a role, being the gracious father-in-law, the accommodating man. But all the while, I was waiting for the moment when they would discover what I had left for them, when they would see, really see, what Raymond Harlow had been to his son and what that meant. The night they arrived, I cooked dinner. A roast chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, a salad from my garden. I set the table nicely and waited for them to settle in. Robert and Patricia Malone were tired from their drive, but pleasant enough. They thanked me for taking them in. They seemed to understand, at least somewhat, that this was an imposition on my life, my peace, my retreat. Marcus and Victoria stayed for dinner but left afterward, Victoria explaining that they had to drive back to the city, that they had work in the morning. She didn't even look at me as she said goodbye. As I watched them drive away, I felt something shift inside me. I was ready. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The next morning, after Robert and Patricia had gone out for a walk and were exploring property, I asked Patricia if she'd like to see the reading room. It was a casual invitation, the kind a host makes to show off their home. She smiled and said she'd love to, that she'd always been interested in books. We climbed the stairs to the small bedroom where I'd arranged everything. The moment we walked in, I could see her face change. She looked at the walls, at the photographs, at the journal, at all the evidence of a life lived in love and sacrifice. And then she started to cry. I left her alone in the room. I went downstairs and sat in the kitchen, and I waited. Within an hour, Robert had come inside and gone upstairs. Within 2 hours, they both read through enough of my journal to understand. Patricia came down first, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say anything. She just sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I could see that she understood. She understood what her daughter had done to my son. She understood what Victoria had taken from him by erasing me. She understood what I've been trying to preserve by creating this space, this time capsule of a father's love. Robert followed about an hour later, and he sat down beside his wife. "We didn't know," he said quietly. "Victoria doesn't talk about you. When Marcus mentions you at all, she shuts him down immediately. We had no idea how much you'd done for him, how much you loved him." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They were seeing the truth now, and the truth was more powerful than any words I could say. Over the next few days, something shifted in the cottage. Robert and Patricia weren't just my unwilling guests anymore. They were witnesses to a story that was breaking their hearts. They asked me questions about Marcus's childhood, about his mother, about how I'd managed to raise him alone. I told them everything. I told them about working 60-hour weeks and still finding time to help with homework. I told them about the years when it was just the two of us against the world. I told him about how proud I was when he graduated, how excited I was about his future, how much I'd want him to be happy and successful. I told him about the phone calls that stopped coming, about the year-long silence, about the realization that I'd been erased. And they listened, really listened, with the kind of attention that comes from truly understanding what someone has lost. On the fourth day, Robert told me that Victoria had called and told him I'd been fired from my job years ago for theft, which was completely fabricated. She'd told him I was an alcoholic, which was false. She'd told him I'd been abusive to Marcus as a child, which was the most sickening lie of all. They believed her because they had no reason not to, because this was their daughter-in-law, because why would she lie about something so serious? But seeing my home, reading my journal, meeting me as a real person, they finally understood that they'd been systematically deceived. That night, Robert called Marcus. I heard him from the other room, his voice firm and angry. He told his son-in-law that they were not comfortable with the way he'd been treating me, that he needed to explain himself, that his parents deserved better. I heard Marcus deny everything, heard him say that his father had made his life difficult, that he needed distance to be successful, that mental health professionals had advised him to set boundaries. But I also heard Robert say something that made my chest tighten. He said, "I've read your father's journal. I've seen photographs of your entire childhood. I've been here in his home, the place he escaped to just to get away from the pain you and Victoria caused him. And I'm going to tell you something. You're going to regret this. You're going to look back on your life and realize what you lost." After that phone call, things shifted. Marcus called me for the first time in almost 3 years. His voice was different, less confident, more vulnerable. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was fine, that I'd been fine, that I'd learned to live without him. He asked me if I was angry with him. I told him the truth. I said I had been angry, but anger requires energy, and I decided to invest my energy in other things. I said I loved him, but I'd also learned to love myself, and sometimes those things had to exist separately. He didn't know what to say to that. After we hung up, I didn't know if we'd ever be close again, but something felt different. Something felt like a door had opened, even if I wasn't sure what was on the other side. Robert and Patricia stayed at the cottage for 2 months. During that time, we became genuine friends. They helped me with projects around the property. We cooked together, took walks together, and talked about life and loss and regret. They told me about raising Victoria, about the ways they'd made mistakes, about how their daughter had become someone they didn't recognize, someone driven by status and money, and the need to remake everyone around her into something more acceptable. They were grieving, I realized, not just for the relationship between Marcus and me, but for the daughter they'd known before ambition and Victoria's own insecurities had consumed her. Before they left, Patricia gave me something. It was a letter, handwritten by her, addressed to Marcus. She told me that it contained everything she'd learned during her time in my home, everything she understood now about what she and her husband had allowed to happen. She told me that she didn't know if it would make a difference, if her son would read it and understand, but she had to try. She told me that family was the most important thing, more important than money or status or any external measure of success. She told me that she loved me, not as her son's father, but as a man worthy of respect and love. 2 weeks after Robert and Patricia left, Marcus arrived at the cottage alone. Victoria was not with him. He looked different, older somehow, like something inside him had aged overnight. We sat on the porch, and we didn't talk for a long time. Finally, he said, "I read Mom's letter. She told me everything about your home, about your journal, about your life here." I asked him what he thought about it. He said, "I think I made a lot of mistakes." I told him that everyone makes mistakes, that the question was what you did after you made them. We talked for hours. Marcus told me about his life, about how unhappy he was, about how Victoria had been cheating on him for years, about how his therapist had been biased and more interested in Victoria's money than in actual healing. He told me that he'd spent years running from his childhood, ashamed of where he came from, desperate to prove that he was something more, but that running had led him nowhere good. He'd achieved everything he thought he wanted, and it was all hollow. We talked about his mother, about the stories I'd told him as a child that he'd somehow forgotten. We talked about his dreams, about what he really wanted out of life, not what Victoria or anyone else wanted for him. I didn't forgive him immediately. Real forgiveness takes time, and I wasn't ready to erase the years of pain that his abandonment had caused. But I also wasn't interested in revenge anymore. I'd learned something in that cottage, something that took 62 years to understand. True strength isn't about getting even. It's not about making someone else feel your pain. True strength is standing in your own truth and allowing other people to see who you really are. True strength is creating a life that matters, regardless of whether anyone recognizes your worth. True strength is loving people even when they've hurt you, but refusing to sacrifice yourself in the process. Marcus started coming to the cottage every weekend. Victoria has since filed for divorce, finally tired of a husband who was pulling away from the life she'd built for him. Robert and Patricia have moved into a small apartment in town, close to the cottage, becoming part of the quiet community I'd built around myself. I've learned to let people in again, but carefully, thoughtfully, choosing relationships based on genuine connection rather than obligation. My son is learning slowly to become his own person again, separate from Victoria's influence and his own fears. The cottage in the forest is no longer just my sanctuary. It's become a place where real people can gather and be honest about their lives, their failures, their hopes. And that, I've discovered, is worth more than all the material success in the world. The surprise I left for Marcus and his wife wasn't meant to humiliate them. It was meant to show them that Raymond Harlow had mattered, that his life had had meaning, that his love had been real and true and worthy of recognition. And in the end, they finally understood. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.